Hello everyone, welcome back. My name is Elizabeth Podsiadlo, and I'm going to continue reading from my book, Talking Pictures. Today we will be reading chapters 2 and chapters 3, if I can spit the words out. The wind continues to be very strong today. They're expecting it throughout the day. It's a perfect day to be inside with a fire and reading a good book. Chapter 2. The day Barbara returned home was cold, and the sky was brilliant blue with large fluffy clouds. There was a light biting wind that made the windows rattle from time to time. Barbara did not feel much like doing anything. She stood at the window in her bedroom and looked out into the semi-frozen lake. It was in this silence she heard what sounded like a very loud truck pull up into the driveway. She looked out the window of her living room and saw that a moving truck had pulled into the driveway of the house next door. Barbara watched as a blue automobile pulled up to the curb in front of the house and a man got out. He looked to be in his early 40s, but it was hard to tell from where she stood. One thing was for sure, he was moving in, and judging by the size of the moving truck, he had a lot of stuff. Out of boredom and a lack of motivation, Barbara watched from the kitchen window, her tiny china cup in both hands, sipping and watching as the movers unloaded bookshelves, antique china cabinets, and a beautiful iron pot rack that had iron leaves all around it. After about an hour and what seemed an unending amount of boxes, the movers unloaded what looked to be an enormous commercial stove and oven. It was like one of those very expensive stoves that looked commercial, but it's for the home. Intrigued, Barbara spoke to herself. Not only is he a somewhat attractive man moving in next door, but apparently a man who likes to cook. She couldn't help but wonder if there was a Mrs. who would be coming later. It was starting to get dark, and Barbara was getting hungry. She hadn't eaten all day and wasn't inspired to cook anything. But hunger can be a mean taskmaster, and she wasn't the type to eat junk. She pulled a container of homemade smoked turkey broth from the freezer. She loved smoked turkey broth and what it did for split pea soup. She boiled the broth, threw in a bay leaf, some dried onions, marjoram, carrots, and a cup of dried split peas, brought it to a medium simmer, and cooked it until the peas dissolved. From the fridge, she pulled a slice of slightly stale rye bread and toasted it. She spread butter onto the hot rye bread, and it melted and dripped into the plate where she placed it. Alongside the plate, she placed her soup bowl and filled it with aromatic soup. Not only was the soup good, it brought a person a great sense of health once eating it because of the potassium in the peas. She sat down at her table and was just about to take a sip when she heard her mother's voice from the bedroom saying, "Eat slowly. Chew your food 20 times before you swallow. You'll get full faster and eat less." Startled, Barbara got up and went to her bedroom to see the photo glowing from the frame. Her mother's beautiful face brought Barbara joy and pain at the same time, but it was too beautiful not to look at. She picked up the frame and held it close to her heart, tears falling down her cheeks. She pulled the picture frame in front of her to see the face one more time, but the image had faded. She put it back on her desk and went back to the kitchen. Just as she was about to sit down, the doorbell rang. Startled, Barbara looked through the side window to see who could it be. None of her friends knew she was home yet. Looking out onto her front porch stoop, Barbara saw the man she'd been watching all day. There he was, not even wearing a coat, rubbing his hands together. She opened her door a crack and said, "Can I help you?" "Yes," he said, "I'm your new neighbor." "Yes, I saw you move in," Barbara said. "Welcome to the neighborhood." Barbara opened the door a little further. "Is there something I can help you with?" "Yes," he said, "I need some matches or a lighter to start the pilot light on my stove. Can you believe there are no matches in that old place?" What smells so good? Smells like smoked pea soup." Barbara was a little surprised. He could tell what kind of soup she had made, but answered, "That's right, you have a good sense of smell." He laughed. "I have a good sense of smell and an even better sense of taste. Well, if you could let me borrow a lighter or some matches, I could prepare something as well." Barbara asked him to come in while she looked for the lighter. He stayed at the door as she looked. When she went back into the kitchen, she poured some of the hot soup into a glass canning jar, put the lid on, and pulled some crackers out of the pantry to go with. She put it all in a bag, grabbed the lighter, and went to the front door. "Here," she said, "the lighter and a little soup. Welcome to the neighborhood." He thanked her, Taking the lighter and bag and headed back to the house, she watched him through the window until he went into his home and shut the door. Nice, she thought. Not too pushy, not too handsome, just nice. Later that evening, Barbara sat at her desk, looking over one of the leather volumes she had gotten from her mother. She wasn't sure where she was going to find venison jerky, but one of the recipes she had come across was intriguing, enough to make her want to use all the intended ingredients. She logged onto the internet to search when the frame on her desk brightened with her mother's picture. This was a picture of her mother in her 30s. She wore a black, beautiful fitted skirt that went just below her knees with a white polka-dotted blouse. Her hair was up in a twist and she wore some pearl earrings. Her mother's voice chimed, "The way to a man's heart is through his stomach." Barbara was stunned. Had her mother really just said the way to a man's heart was through his stomach? Indeed, there was wisdom there. Timely wisdom. Barbara watched as this beautiful photo of her mother faded and she headed to bed. Picture of Barbara's mother. The next morning, the sun streamed through her frost-rimmed bedroom window. Let me try that again. The next morning, the sun streamed through her frost-rimmed bedroom window. Barbara rose, showered, and dressed. The phone rang, and her friend Kathy was on the line. She offered her condolences and asked if she could come over. Barbara welcomed the company and invited Kathy over, promising to prepare her favorite French onion soup with Gruyere cheese. Barbara stepped out into the brilliant daylight. It was still bitingly cold, but she had to make a trip to the market. Lucky for her, she had a garage, so there would be no ice to scrape. She pulled out and headed to her favorite market, Marbella's. Marbella's market was inherited by an old friend of Barbara's named Katrina. Marbella was Katrina's grandmother from Italy. Her reputation for fresh produce, excellent cheeses, and wines was what made this market so successful. It had been open since 1940, which was apparent by the beautiful woodwork that framed the shelving throughout the store. The floor tiles were original and yet looked new. The ceiling still had the original embossed tin that curved from the walls to the ceiling with a pattern of grapes and leaves. The aisles were always stocked to the hilt with imported Italian olives and olive oils of every grade. There were chocolates and pastas, pastries, dried beans of every kind, special pasta flours, pasta makers, you name it. If it was Italian, Marbella's had it. The deli had Italian specialities like prosciutto and the best cheese. The floors looked clean enough to eat off of, and the entire store always smelled like freshly baked breads and smoked meats. This was one of the few remaining mom-and-pop stores for miles. The community took great pride in this fact and responded with their loyalty and business. Indeed, Marbella's market practically put this little town on the map. As Barbara entered the produce aisle, she saw her new neighbor checking out the cabbages. The onions were next to the cabbages, as were the potatoes. She approached the onions. "Hello," she said. He looked up. "Well, hello to you, neighbor. I see you've discovered our quaint market," Barbara said as she loaded up a bag full of onions. "Indeed," he said. "It's amazing how many unusual things they carry here, isn't it? I was worried when I moved in that I wouldn't be able to find ingredients I needed, but I am comforted at what I've seen so far. Did you know she carries truffle paste? Can you believe it?" Barbara smiled. "Truffle paste? I must admit I didn't realize she carried truffle paste. What do you make with truffle paste?" "Well, I don't know," he said, "but wow, that's a pretty special ingredient. You know, it's $15 a tube. Wonder who buys the stuff." Again, Barbara smiled. Such a funny thing to get worked up over. "Do you cook?" she asked. He looked up from his cabbages. "Yes, I do cook, but mostly soups." Barbara was stunned. "You cook soups?" "Yes, by the way, that smoked split turkey soup you made was quite delicious. Really." Barbara blushed and went back to picking out onions. She thanked him for his compliment and made for the bakery section of the shop. The girl at the counter was a friend and smiled up at Barbara as she approached the counter. "Hi, Barbara." "Hi, Betsy." "You come for your regular order today?" "Yes, and I also want some day-old French bread." Betsy laughed. "Why do you want the stale stuff, Barbara? I have some fresh baked right here, and it doesn't cost that much more." "Listen, Betsy," Barbara said enthusiastically, "I need the stale bread because I'm going to just toast it to death and drown it in my sherry-laced onion soup. Then I'm going to top it with Gruyere cheese and broil it till it melts down the side of the ramekin. I need a tough old piece of bread to hold up to the torch or it will turn into goo." Barbara stood looking wide-eyed at Barbara. Wow, sounds like you better take the stale stuff, all right. Barbara smiled. She had hammed it up a bit, but it was worth seeing the expression on Betsy's face. Turning to leave, she nearly bowled over her new neighbor, who was also apparently wowed by her description. "You're making onion soup?" he said. "Didn't you just make split pea soup?" Barbara, embarrassed by his witnessing her expression and a need for stale bread, answered meekly, "Well, I have a friend coming to visit me later, and she loves my onion soup." He looked at Barbara and said, "Well, anyone who can make a good onion soup is a good friend to have. We'll have to compare some notes sometime." He smiled as she passed and went to pay for her groceries. Driving home, she felt an unnamed excitement. It was fun having a new neighbor, not to mention he appears to be single, likes to cook, and specializes in making soups. "I better buy more canning jars," she thought to herself, and smiled as she drove through town to her home. That was the end of chapter 2. I'm going to continue with chapter 3. Here's the recipe for the split pea soup. Chapter 3. It was nearly 4 in the afternoon when Barbara returned home. She had put away all her groceries and started slicing onions. She knew several tricks to slicing onions that kept a lot of the spray from her eyes. She knew that slicing a cold onion was not as bad as a room temperature onion, and she knew that if she wet the cutting board and a knife, that most of the spray from the onions would go to the wet areas. Most importantly, she always kept her mouth closed when cutting the onions. Making onion soup meant slicing a lot of onions very thin. She melted butter in a large, heavy-bottomed soup pot and added 2 cloves of minced garlic. She sautéed the onions until they were translucent, added fresh thyme, sherry, and wine, and finally the stalks. There were different schools of thought when it came to making onion soup. Did you use beef stock or chicken stock or vegetable stock? Barbara liked to use beef and chicken stock. The beef for its richness and color, and the chicken for its ability to complement the flavors of the onions. Barbara added the stock and let the soup simmer for an hour. Kathy arrived just as the sun was setting, flowers in one hand and a bottle of Cabernet in the other. Kathy had been a friend to Barbara for many years. She was a good friend who knew Barbara well enough to know when to talk and when to listen. They had just finished off their soup, and Kathy was pulling the last bits of Gruyere off the side of the ramekin when a voice sounded from the bedroom. "A friend in need is a friend indeed." And here is the picture that appears on the frame. Barbara looked at Kathy and quickly headed to the bedroom. Kathy followed. The picture frame on Barbara's desk was glowing with a photo of her mother and her friend Nancy, arm in arm, wearing colorful hats and smiling. Kathy looked at the photo and then at Barbara. "Is this your mother?" Barbara nodded and watched as the photo on the frame faded and walked back into the kitchen. "You know, it's the strangest thing," Barbara said as she took a sip of wine. "What is the strangest thing?" "That picture." "Yeah, I've never seen one like that. Most of them just show pictures, but yours talks." "It's not just that it talks," said Barbara. Mom always says something appropriate, and what's more is it's only supposed to hold 6 messages, and yet I think I've heard at least 8 different messages." Kathy looked at Barbara and sat down at the table. Barbara stared into the low-burning candle on the table and told Kathy all that had happened, the dream, the messages that seemed so timely, the books, and about her new neighbor. When Barbara finished, they both sat quietly. Kathy went over to the bedroom and looked at the frame. "It's gone dark." "Yes, it always goes dark after it goes off." "Does it come on at regular intervals?" Kathy asked. I don't think it does," Barbara said as she sat down at her desk. "It has repeated messages, but it doesn't always say good night, for instance. I'd probably be inclined to shut it off from time to time if it did." Kathy picked up the frame. "Well, how do you turn it off?" She examined the frame. There were no buttons, no place for batteries, and for that matter, no seams at all. "Well, it seems to be very well made," Kathy said as she put it back on the desk. "Well, I wouldn't try to make too much of it. I would think it would be nice to hear your mother's voice and see pictures of her as if she had... Well, I wouldn't try to make too much of it. I would think it would be nice to hear my mother's voice and see pictures of her if she had passed away." Barbara nodded. Kathy was right. It had brought her great comfort. She would always run into the room whenever the frame spoke. Before her mother had died, they would talk on the phone every day, sometimes a couple times a day, and Barbara missed that, and having this frame seemed to ease the pain. So tell me about this new neighbor. Kathy had a grin on her face. Well, he seems to be very nice. Nice? Is good? Is he married? Kathy had headed towards the kitchen window and pulled the curtains to see the house where he lived. I'm not sure if he's married or not, but judging by the stuff I saw coming off the moving truck, I would say he's not. One thing I do know is he cooks, and apparently soups are his specialty. No way. That's uncanny. Kathy was quite animated. Now, how many folks do you know that specialize in soups, for crying out loud? That's amazing. Barbara couldn't help but smile. It did seem a little too good to be true. Well, what does he look like? Barbara thought. Well, I guess you could say he looks like a cross between young Robert Redford and Father Jason from church. So he's blonde and fairly good looking. Fairly, Barbara smiled. He is average in height and weight, fit, but not too fit. Now Kathy was laughing. Well, please be sure to invite me over if the two of you decide to cook something together. I'd love to be the guinea pig. Barbara and Kathy both started to laugh over the stillness of it all. Kathy was a good friend and had a way of putting things in perspective. When she left, Barbara felt better, even hopeful. And here is the onion soup recipe with the Gruyere. That's the end of chapter 2 and 3. If you enjoy the book and the story, you can purchase them off my website, theoperasinginchef.com. You can click on the link and I'll send you a copy right out. You can also find them once the stores start opening up again at the Romney Co-op and Anderson's Corner. If you have questions, theoperasinginchef.com. But thank you again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. See you tomorrow.